Eleanor Bennett did not cry when the man she had traveled 900 miles to marry looked at her like she was a mistake. She stood in the dust of Red Willow's main street, one battered suitcase at her feet and a rolled canvas of tools across her back, and she watched Samuel Whitaker's jaw tighten, watched his eyes drop once and come back up empty of the thing she had hoped to find there. She had seen that look before. She had survived it before. What Samuel Whitaker did not yet know was that Eleanor Bennett had never once failed to fix a broken thing. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end, because what happens next is going to surprise you. Drop your city in the comments below, because I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Red Willow, Kansas, 1884, and meet the woman nobody saw coming. The stagecoach from St. Louis arrived 40 minutes late, which gave Samuel Whitaker 40 extra minutes to stand in front of Callaway's general store with his hat in his hands and his stomach pulled tight as a new fence wire. He had not told anyone in Red Willow what he was doing there. He had told himself it was a practical decision, not a personal one. The ranch needed managing. He needed a capable woman. The matrimonial agency had assured him the candidate was sensible, skilled, with a needle, and accustomed to hard work. He had read the letter 3 times, decided the whole arrangement was reasonable, and signed his name at the bottom before he could talk himself out of it. He was 42 years old. He had been a widower for 6 years. Reasonable was all he had left. The stage came in loud and dust-heavy wheels grinding hard against the packed earth as it swung to a stop in front of the depot. A boy ran forward to catch the lead horse. 3 passengers stepped down, a traveling salesman with a sample case, a young couple clinging to each other's arms, and then last of all, Eleanor Bennett. Samuel saw her feet first. Sturdy brown boots, well worn at the toe, planted firmly in the dirt with the kind of certainty that said their owner had stepped onto uncertain ground before and had not fallen yet. Then the rest of her, a plain brown traveling gown let out at the seams and repaired so many times the fabric held more thread than original cloth. A round face flushed from the heat, chestnut brown hair pinned back without ceremony, calm gray eyes that swept the street once and found him before he had taken a single step forward. She was not what he had pictured. He had pictured something smaller, quieter, simpler. He had pictured a woman who would fit without difficulty into the space his first wife had left behind. Eleanor Bennett looked like she would fill every room she entered and rearrange the furniture while she was at it. She carried one battered suitcase in her right hand. Across her back, she carried a heavy canvas roll tied at both ends with leather cord thick enough that it took both his hired hand's shoulders to carry a similar load. Whatever was inside it clinked with the sound of metal tools. Samuel took one step toward her and stopped. 2 young men near the feed store entrance had noticed her too. He heard one of them say something low and ugly to the other. He heard the other one laugh. He did not catch the exact words, but he understood them well enough because he had watched the same calculation pass across a dozen faces in the 30 seconds since Eleanor Bennett had stepped off that coach, the quick dismissive measurement that certain people performed on other people they had already decided did not matter. He felt something tighten in his chest that he did not entirely understand. He crossed the street. "Miss Bennett," he said, and he kept his voice level, kept his hat in his hands, kept his eyes on her face, and nowhere else. "Mr. Whitaker," she said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were steady. But he had spent enough years around working people to recognize when someone had braced themselves for impact, and Eleanor Bennett was braced. "I'll take your bag," he said. "I've got it," she said. "I always carry my own tools." He did not argue. He gestured toward the wagon instead and fell into step beside her, and for 30 feet, neither of them said a single word. Then she stopped walking. He stopped too, and turned, and found her looking at him with those gray eyes that gave away very little and assessed everything. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, "I think it would be better for both of us if we were honest with each other right now before we ride anywhere together." He put his hat back on his head. "All right." "You expected someone different." It was not a question. He answered it anyway. The agency described you as skilled at sewing and domestic management. I am skilled at sewing, Nell said, but I am not a seamstress. I don't make dresses or curtains or decorative linens. I repair wagon canvas freight tents, harness leather grain storage sacks, and industrial equipment. I've worked in a freight workshop in St. Louis for 12 years. I can cook a plain meal, and I can keep a house clean. But if you wrote to that agency looking for someone to embroider tablecloths and make your kitchen pretty, then we are both about to waste a great deal of time. Samuel stared at her. She held his gaze without flinching. Why didn't the agency mention that? He said. I suspect, Nell said, because they believed you would not have agreed to meet me if they had. And they may have been right. The honesty of it landed harder than he expected. He looked down at the canvas roll on her back, then back at her face. I wrote to the agency, he said slowly, because my ranch needs managing. The books are in poor shape. Equipment breaks faster than I can replace it. I've got 5 men who've stayed loyal past the point any reasonable person would, and I can't keep asking them to do that without something changing. What is costing your ranch the most money? Nell asked. He opened his mouth and closed it again. It was a question he had never been asked directly, and the fact that he could not immediately answer it bothered him considerably. I don't know exactly, he admitted. Nell nodded as though that answer told her something important. Then perhaps, she said, we ought to ride out and see. They climbed onto the wagon without ceremony. Samuel took the reins. Nell set her suitcase at her feet and rested the canvas tool roll carefully between them. She did not make small talk. She looked at everything they passed. The road out of Red Willow ran northwest through open grassland before it began climbing toward the ridge where Samuel's father had built the ranch 20 years earlier. It was good land, Samuel had always known that, but good land needed working, and the evidence of years without enough hands or enough money showed in every fence post they passed. Nell saw it too. He could tell by the way her eyes moved, not casually, not the way a woman admires scenery, but with the focused cataloging attention of someone who is already calculating repair sequences. She did not comment on the broken fence at the south boundary. She looked at it. She did not comment on the hay wagon with the patched cover sagging at one corner. She studied the seam. She did not comment on the length of harness leather hanging loose from the post near the gate, cracked along its length and tied together with common twine in a repair that would last about another 2 hard weeks. She said nothing until they came over the final rise and Whitaker Ridge spread out below them, the main house, the barn, the bunkhouse, the equipment shed, and the cattle pen where what remained of his herd moved in the afternoon heat. How long has the barn roof been leaking? She asked. He looked at her sideways. How do you know it's leaking? The weather vane mounting has pulled away from the peak on the north side. When that happens, the sheathing underneath starts separating too. Rainwater follows the gap. You've probably got wet hay in your loft that you haven't dealt with yet, and at least one section of rafter that needs attention before winter. Samuel was quiet for a moment. 3 years, he said. Nell turned back to look at the barn, and something in her expression shifted. Not pity, not judgment, but the kind of clear-eyed recognition that a person gets when they understand the full size of a problem and are already deciding how to begin. Drive down, she said. I'd like to see the equipment before dark. The ranch hands were gathered near the bunkhouse when the wagon came in. Samuel watched them register Nell the same way the townspeople had the same quick measurement, the same silent conclusion. He saw one of them, young Danny Marsh, nudge Billy Turner with his elbow. Samuel climbed down from the wagon. Nell climbed down herself before he could offer a hand and lifted both the suitcase and the tool roll without asking for assistance. Men? Samuel said, "This is Miss Bennett. She'll be taking up residence in the house." There were nods. There was a careful silence. Nell met each of them directly with those gray eyes and said, "Gentlemen," in a tone that acknowledged them without requiring anything from them. They went inside for supper. Rosa, the Mexican woman who cooked for the ranch when her own household allowed it, had left a pot of beef stew on the iron stove and a pan of cornbread on the table. The ranch hands filed in and filled the long benches. Samuel sat at the head. Nell sat at the far end closest to the kitchen. It was Danny Marsh who said it. He said it quietly, meant for the man beside him, but the table was not large and the room was not loud, and Samuel heard every word. "Reckon that chair's gonna hold?" It wasn't the worst thing Samuel had heard a man say. It wasn't even close. But something about the casualness of it, the ease with which a young man could reduce another human being to a structural concern, lit a slow fire behind Samuel's sternum. "Marsh," he said. The table went still. "You'll apologize," Samuel said. "Right now, out loud." Danny Marsh went red. "I know what you were just doing," Samuel said. "And you'll stop it, and you'll apologize to Miss Bennett, or you'll collect your gear tonight." The silence at the table had the particular quality of men who are watching something unexpected unfold and are not sure which way to stand. Danny Marsh turned toward Nell. His face was red and his jaw was tight, and the apology when it came was not a good one, but it was an apology. "Sorry, miss," he said. Nell looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you, Mr. Marsh," and picked up her spoon, and that was the end of it. Except it wasn't quite. Because Samuel had expected her to look grateful, or relieved, or vindicated. Instead, she just looked tired, the particular tiredness of a person for whom this kind of moment is not exceptional, who has been defended before and knows the defense is temporary, who understands that what changes a man's tongue is not a reprimand, but evidence. Samuel filed that away. He did not sleep well that night. He lay in the dark of his bedroom and listened to the wind move against the house and thought about the question she had asked him in the street. "What is costing your ranch the most money?" He had spent 4 years trying to answer a different version of that question. He had counted cattle and priced feed and calculated wages and studied the beef market. He had done everything a reasonable man does when his operation is failing. He had looked at the numbers. But numbers are what something costs. They do not always tell you why. He was still thinking about it when he fell asleep just before dawn. Nell was already in the barn when he woke up. He found her there an hour before breakfast, moving through the equipment shed, with a small lantern held close, running her hands along canvas surfaces, and leather straps, and wooden tool handles, with the focused, unhurried attention of a physician conducting an examination. She had changed out of her traveling gown into a work dress of heavy dark cotton, and her canvas roll was open on the workbench tools, laid out in a sequence that made no immediate sense to Samuel, but clearly made perfect sense to her. "You're up early," he said. "I wanted to see everything before the men started moving it," she said without looking up from the grain sack she was holding to the lantern light. The sack had a seam running along its left side that had been re-sewn badly at least 3 times. "Mr. Whitaker, how much grain are you losing per month?" "I don't measure it that way." She turned and looked at him. In the lantern light, her face was very direct. "Then you should start. This sack has been restitched with the wrong thread 3 times. Every time it's refilled, it loses roughly 1/10 of its capacity through the seam before anyone notices. Multiply that across all your storage across 12 months, and you're not talking about a small amount of grain. You're talking about a structural bleed." He crossed his arms. "A structural bleed. That's what I call it," she said. "When a working system loses a small amount through a flaw that no one has prioritized fixing. It doesn't look like a crisis. It looks like the cost of doing business. But over time, it adds up to the difference between surviving and not." Samuel looked at the grain sack. He had looked at it before many times. He had seen the bad stitching. He had meant to have it dealt with. He had always had something more urgent to attend to first. "How many of them are like this?" he asked. "All 12, she said. "And your main freight wagon cover has a crown seam failure that's been patched 4 times instead of properly addressed. The next time you haul supplies in heavy rain, you'll lose whatever's underneath it." She set the sack down and moved to the wagon. "The harness on your lead team has 3 sections of cracked leather that have been oiled but not replaced. That leather is going to fail. The question is whether it fails in the yard or on the road." She said all of this without drama, without accusation, without the slightest hint that she expected him to feel bad about it. She said it the way a person states observable facts. Samuel stood there in the early morning quiet of his equipment shed and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt seen. Not flattered, not praised, seen. The way a problem gets seen when the right person finally looks at it clearly. "What would you need?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "To start thread. The correct weight and wax finish for canvas work and for leather. A proper awl, the one on your bench, is the wrong angle for the material you're working with. Time. And I would like to move the workbench to where the morning light comes in from the east side. That's all. For the first week," she said. "Then we'll see." He ordered the thread from Callaway's store that morning. He moved the workbench himself that afternoon, which required taking apart the south wall bracket and rehinging the storage door, which took 2 hours longer than he expected. He did not complain about this. Nell began with the grain sacks. 12 grain sacks disassembled at their worst seams, restitched with the correct waxed thread, at the correct tension tested by filling them with sand and checking the drainage. It took her 3 days. When she finished, she showed Samuel the difference between the original seam construction and the repaired one, holding both up to the light so he could see the thread pattern. "You didn't just patch it," he said. "Patching buys time," she said. "Repair addresses the cause. There's a difference." He watched her work the way he used to watch his father work, not because he was supervising, but because he recognized the quality of concentrated skill, and it was worth observing. Her hands were fast and extraordinarily precise. She adjusted her grip constantly, finding mechanical advantage in the way she positioned her body against the canvas, using her weight and strength not as limitations, but as tools. The ranch hands watched too, though they worked hard to pretend they were not watching. Billy Turner was the first one to stop pretending. Billy was 23 years old, bright enough to know he didn't know everything, and honest enough to be troubled by the fact that he had laughed at Danny's joke the night before, even if he hadn't made it himself. He showed up at the barn door 3 days into Nell's work, with a canvas coat over one arm and his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, "I was wondering if you might look at this." The coat had a tear along the left shoulder seam, and someone, Billy himself from the look of it, had attempted to close the tear with a whip stitch, using the wrong thread, pulling the fabric out of alignment, and creating a pucker that would continue to pull apart under stress. Nell took the coat and examined it without comment. Then she said, "Sit down, Mr. Turner." He sat on the upturned crate near the workbench. "I'm going to fix this," she said, "and while I do, I'm going to show you what you did wrong. Not because you're stupid, the instinct to repair was right, but because the technique was wrong. And wrong technique on canvas means the repair fails faster than the original damage." Billy leaned forward. His attention was total. She unpicked his stitching and laid the seam open. She showed him the tension differential, the thread weight, the angle of insertion. She explained why canvas behaves differently from cotton shirting, and why the instinct to pull tighter when stitching heavy material produces the opposite of the intended result. "You want the thread to grip," she said, "not the fabric to compress. You're trying to create a bond, not a clamp." Billy asked 4 questions. Good questions, specific and practical. Nell answered each one without impatience. When she handed him back the coat, the shoulder lay smooth and flat, the repaired seam invisible under the original surface grain. Billy put his hand over the repair and pressed. He could not find the edge. "How do you learn all that?" he said. "Same way you learn to rope a steer," she said. "Somebody shows you the basics and then you do it 10,000 times." He went back to work. But after supper that evening, he asked if he could watch her work on the harness straps, and Nell said he could if he didn't distract her, and he sat on the opposite crate and watched in silence for 2 hours. It was 4 days later that Amos Reed came to the barn. Amos was the oldest man on Samuel's crew, 58 years old, barrel-chested and slow-moving, with hands that had been damaged by decades of cold work and a permanent squint from years in the prairie sun. He did not talk much. He had worked Whitaker Ridge for 11 years longer than any other hand, and Samuel trusted him more than he trusted most people. He came to the barn in the early afternoon, carrying a leather apron folded over his arm. He set it on the workbench without speaking, and looked at Nell and waited. Nell unfolded the apron. It was old. The leather was the color of dark amber supple, in a way that only comes from years of honest use, worn smooth along the bib and creased at every fold. But the apron had cracked along the left bib strap, and the crack had been spreading for some time, and the leather around it had begun to stiffen and break down. Nell ran her thumb along the crack and turned the apron over. On the reverse, worn almost to invisibility but still readable. If you knew what to look for, were two initials pressed into the leather near the lower hem. M.R. She looked at Amos. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the apron, and the set of his jaw told the whole story. "I'll need to clean it first," Nell said quietly. "Then I'll stabilize the cracked section with a leather compound and stitch a reinforcement brace on the reverse. You won't see it from the front. The strap will be stronger than before. It'll hold for another 20 years at least." Amos cleared his throat. "It was my wife's," he said. "She used it in the garden. She passed 4 winters back." "I'll take good care of it," Nell said. He nodded once and left. Nell worked on the apron that evening after supper, alone in the barn with a single lantern. She did not hurry. She did the cleaning in 3 careful stages, worked the conditioning compound in with her fingertips until the leather regained its flexibility, and then she stitched the brace in the thinnest thread she had with stitches so small they would not be visible from the front at all. When Amos came to collect it the next morning, he stood holding it for a long moment. He pressed his thumb to the place where the crack had been. The surface was continuous and smooth. He folded the apron carefully along its old creases and tucked it under his arm. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Yes, Mr. Reed. Anybody gives you trouble around here," he said, "you let me know." He went back to work. That afternoon, when Danny Marsh started to say something cutting about the amount of space Nell's new workbench was taking up in the equipment shed, Amos Reed turned and looked at him from across the yard, with an expression that required no words at all. Danny Marsh found somewhere else to be. Samuel, who had observed all of this from the porch steps, went inside and opened his account books. He had been doing this every evening for the past 2 weeks, pulling out the ledger columns and looking at them the way he might look at a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. But something was different now. He was looking at the same numbers with a different question underneath them. Where is the structural bleed? He found it in 4 places within an hour. He was still sitting at the desk when Nell came in from the barn, wiping her hands on a work cloth. She stopped in the doorway of the study when she saw his expression. "You found something," she said. "4 somethings," he said. "Come look." She sat down across the table from him, and he turned the ledger so she could read it. She studied the columns without speaking, her finger moving down the rows. She turned 2 pages back, then 2 pages forward. "You've been replacing the wagon cover 3 times in 2 years?" she said. "Bad luck with weather," he said. "Or a supplier selling you substandard canvas," she said. "The replacement cost is almost double what a professional repair on a quality cover would run." "Who are you buying from?" he told her. She nodded slowly in a way that suggested she already suspected the answer. "And this line here," she said, tapping the ledger. "Harness replacement spring and fall both. The leather wears out." "Leather doesn't wear out that fast if it's properly maintained," she said. "It fails that fast if it's been stored wet or oiled with the wrong compound. Who's doing the maintenance?" He told her that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said carefully, "Mr. Whitaker, do you know a man called Horace Blackwell?" Samuel's expression shifted. "I know him. He runs the biggest general store in Red Willow. He holds the supply contract for most of the ranches in the county." Nell nodded again slowly. "I've been buying thread and materials from Callaway's, not Blackwell's. But when I looked at the cord that was used to repair your tack last season, the grade was wrong. It's the grade a man uses when he's trying to save pennies on material and charge full price for the job. You're saying someone sold me inferior supplies." I'm saying, Nell said evenly, that the math on your equipment costs is consistent with someone profiting from your replacements rather than your repairs. She closed the ledger. I can't prove it yet. But I can tell you what I know for certain. I can fix what's already broken for a fraction of what you've been spending to replace it, and when things are fixed properly, they stop needing to be replaced every season. Samuel looked at her across the table. He had brought this woman to his ranch because he needed someone to sew torn clothing and make his neglected house feel less like an abandoned place. He had expected a pair of hands and a quiet presence. He had not expected this. How soon can you finish the grain sacks and the harness work? He said. Another week on the harness, she said. 3 days on the remaining equipment. And after that, she looked at him directly. After that, you tell me what the next biggest problem is, and we work on that. There was something in the steadiness of her gaze that unsettled him not unpleasantly. It was the steadiness of someone who had already calculated the distance to the horizon and was prepared to walk it. All right, he said. He stood and she stood, and there was a moment in the small study where neither of them said anything at all. Miss Bennett, he said finally. Mr. Whitaker, I want to apologize, he said, for the expression on my face when you stepped off that coach. I am not going to pretend you didn't see it. She was quiet for a moment. I have seen worse expressions, she said. I appreciate the apology all the same. It was wrong of me, he said. Yes, she said simply. It was. She said it without cruelty and without softening it, and he nodded once, accepting the weight of that. She said good night and went upstairs, and Samuel stood in his study alone for a while, listening to the wind come across the ridge, thinking about the question she had asked him on the main street of Red Willow. What is costing your ranch the most money? He had thought it was a business question. He was beginning to understand it was a larger question than that about what it costs to stop seeing clearly, to look at the evidence in front of you and dismiss it because it doesn't come in the shape you expected. He picked up the ledger again and began to add up the numbers he had always looked at but never truly seen. The following week, a settler family came up the ranch road in a covered wagon that was listing badly to the right. The canvas crown had split along a 12-inch section of the main seam, and the husband had attempted a field repair with baling twine and a piece of burlap that was already pulling loose in the midday heat. They were heading north to homestead land outside of Dodge, 3 days out, and every mile was going to test whatever remained of that wagon cover. The husband came to the barn door and asked Samuel if there was a tradesman in town who could do a quick patch. Samuel said he had someone better than a tradesman and sent him to talk to Nell. The man was named Garrett, and he was in his 40s, sunburned and skeptical. And when Nell came out of the barn and he understood that she was the tradesman Samuel had referred to, the skepticism went somewhere deeper and less polite. No offense, ma'am, he said, looking past her into the barn, but this is a working freight cover. I need a proper fix. Not a what, Mr. Garrett? Nell said. He stopped. May I examine the damage? She said. He stood aside uncertainly. Nell walked around the wagon and ran her hand along the canvas. She pulled back the failed burlap patch and examined the split beneath it, pressing her fingers along the seam line to test the tension in the surrounding material. Your crown seam has failed at the center point, she said. This isn't a tear the seam itself has let go. A patch here won't hold past the first hard wind. You need the seam opened, cleared of the failed thread, and reset from anchor point to anchor point. About 18 inches of work total. How long will that take? Garrett said. 2 hours, Nell said. Maybe 2.5. He looked at her. He looked at the wagon. He looked back at her. I'll pay for it, his wife said from the wagon seat above them. She was younger than him, travel-worn and practical-eyed, and she had been watching Nell from the moment they rode in. Go on and let her look at it properly, Garrett. Her husband set his jaw. All right, he said finally. But I'll be right here watching. Nell nodded pleasantly. You're welcome to. She worked the seam in the full view of Garrett, his wife, and half the ranch crew who found reasons to occupy themselves in the general vicinity of the barn. She opened the failed section with a seam ripper, cleared the degraded thread, treated the canvas edge with a waterproofing compound, and reset the seam with a double lock stitch that ran the full length of the split and 2 inches past each endpoint. Garrett watched every move with crossed arms and narrowed eyes. When she finished, Nell handed him the wagon bow so he could test the cover tension himself. He pulled it first lightly, then hard. He pressed his thumb into the repaired seam and pushed. It did not move. He walked the length of the wagon, pressing the seam at intervals. He stopped near the tailgate with his hand still resting on the canvas and stood there for a moment. "That's stronger than the original," he said. "A reset seam should be," Nell said. "If it isn't, you've done it wrong." His wife climbed down from the wagon seat without assistance. "How much do we owe you?" she said. Nell named a fair price. The woman paid it without negotiating. As they were climbing back up to leave, Garrett turned from the wagon seat and looked at Nell with an expression that was not exactly comfortable, but was considerably more honest than the one he had arrived with. "That'll hold," he said. It was not an apology, but it was the closest thing to one he had. "It'll hold," Nell agreed. The Garrett wagon rolled north on the Red Willow Road, and Nell went back into the barn, and Samuel, who had watched the whole thing from the corner of the equipment shed without announcing himself, stayed where he was for a while after she had gone inside. He was thinking about what she had said at the workbench 3 nights earlier. Patching buys time. Repair addresses the cause. There's a difference. He had been patching Whitaker Ridge for 4 years. He had been calling it management. He went inside and wrote 3 letters that evening to suppliers in Topeka he had always bypassed in favor of the cheaper local option to a cattle agent in Wichita who had reached out to him 6 months earlier about a breeding arrangement he had declined because he couldn't afford the risk, and to the matrimonial agency in St. Louis. The letter to the agency was the shortest. "The arrangement is satisfactory," he wrote. "Miss Bennett is not what I expected. She is considerably more." He sealed all 3 envelopes and set them on the hall table to go out with the morning post and went to bed and slept better than he had in months. And in the barn by lantern light, Nell Bennett stitched the last of the cracked harness sections, testing each repair by gripping the leather and pulling until she was certain it would hold, until she was certain that when it was put under real pressure, it would not fail, would not let go, would not leave a man stranded on a road with nowhere to turn. She had been doing this for 12 years. She had learned a long time ago that the things most worth repairing were rarely the ones people thought to bring her first. Usually, they brought her the obvious damage, the split seam, the cracked strap, the torn cover. The deeper problems revealed themselves slowly over days and weeks once you had earned enough trust for a person to let you look at what was actually broken. She set down her tools and sat for a moment in the quiet of the barn, listening to the horses move in their stalls and the wind moving high and steady across the ridge. She did not know yet what this place would become. She did not know what she and Samuel Whitaker would build together, or whether the cautious, guarded man in the house above the barn would ever learn to hold hope the way he held everything else in his life carefully, with both hands, like something that might break if you gripped it too hard. But she knew this ranch had good bones, and good bones in her experience were always worth the work. The morning after Samuel sent those 3 letters, Nell found Billy Turner waiting outside the barn before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. He had a coil of damaged rope in his hands and a question on his face that had clearly been there since the night before. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I've been thinking about what you showed me with the canvas coat. The part about tension differential. Does the same principle apply to rope construction?" Nell looked at the coil in his hands. "Where'd you find that?" "Equipment shed. There's a whole pile of them in the back corner. I always figured they were just too worn to use." "Let me see." She took the rope and ran it through her hands, section by section. 3 coils were genuinely finished. The fiber had degraded past the point of safe load bearing. But 2 were repairable, and one of those was in nearly good condition beneath the surface fraying. "Get me the small awl and the fiber brush from the 3rd drawer," she said. Billy went and came back. She spent the next 20 minutes showing him how to assess rope fiber integrity by feel rather than appearance. How to identify where structural failure had actually begun versus where it merely looked worst, and how to braid a splice repair that would hold under working tension. Billy did not say much. He watched with the total concentration she had already come to recognize in him, the kind that meant he was filing everything away, not just following along. When she finished the splice and handed him the rope, he pulled it hard between both fists. It held. "There's a whole craft in this, isn't there?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "There's a whole craft in almost everything," Nell said, "if you look at it long enough." He coiled the rope carefully and took it back to the equipment shed, and Nell went back to the harness work she had started at dawn, and the morning moved forward the way good working mornings do, steadily without drama, with the quiet satisfaction of problems being solved, one careful stitch at a time. It was Amos Reed who first mentioned the name that would eventually become the center of everything. He said it offhandedly, the way a man drops a stone in water without watching where the ripples go. It was the end of the second week. Samuel had ridden into town for supplies. Nell was resoldering a grommet line on the secondary tarp when Amos came in to hang a repaired bridle on its hook, and he stood there for a moment, watching her work before he spoke. "You buying materials from Callaway's?" he said. "For now," Nell said. "Why?" "Blackwell's going to notice," Amos said. "He notices everything that moves in or out of this county, and he don't like competition." Nell set down her soldering iron. "Who is Horace Blackwell exactly? Not the store version. The real one." Amos was quiet long enough that she knew the answer was going to be more than a sentence. "His father came out here before the railroad," he finally said. "Bought land cheap, sold it at a profit when the track came through. Horace built on that. He's got the biggest store in Red Willow, the best credit terms in the county, and a contract with every major ranch within 30 miles. He looked at the tarp in her hands. He also sells replacement equipment to every one of those ranches. New tarps, new canvas, new harness. Every season." Nell looked at him steadily. "Even when the old equipment could be repaired." "Especially then," Amos said. "His prices are fair enough that nobody argues, but fair prices for things you didn't need to replace isn't the same as honest business." He left after that without saying anything more. But Nell sat with what he'd told her for the rest of the afternoon, turning it over, the way she turned a piece of damaged canvas, looking for where the real failure had started, not just where it showed. She had the answer by supper time. She also had a number. She had spent an hour with Samuel's ledger the previous evening, tracing the equipment replacement costs back across 3 years, cross-referencing the replacement dates against the weather records Samuel kept in a separate notebook. The pattern was consistent and deliberate, premium-grade replacements arriving from Blackwell's store within days of any storm damage at prices that were just low enough to feel reasonable. It was elegant in a cold way. You didn't need to lie to a man if you made sure he never had time to repair what broke before the replacement arrived. Samuel came back from town that evening with the supplies and a tight expression that he didn't fully explain until after supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the kitchen was quiet. "Blackwell asked about you," he said. Nell looked up from the account book she was reviewing. "What did he ask? Whether you were settling in? Whether you were managing the household well?" Samuel said the last phrase with a flatness that conveyed exactly how much he thought of it. He made a point of mentioning that ranch wives in this territory generally find the work considerable. His word. "He's taking my measure," Nell said. "Yes," Samuel said. "He is." "Good," she said. "That means he's already heard something." Samuel looked at her. "You don't seem concerned." "I'm not," she said. "Not yet. Concern is appropriate when a threat is immediate. Right now, he's just listening." She turned a page in the ledger. "What concerns me more is this line here. You paid Blackwell's store for 2 full replacement harness sets in March. Storm damage in February," Samuel said. "Everything in the south barn got wet. Did the harnesses actually fail?" He opened his mouth and stopped. "Or did they get wet?" Nell said. "And someone told you they were compromised beyond repair." The silence that followed was the kind that comes when a man realizes he has been assuming facts that were never actually established. It was Blackwell's man who came out to assess the damage, Samuel said slowly. Yes, Nell said. I expect it was. She closed the ledger and looked at him across the table, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because some truths take a little room to sit in before a person is ready to talk about them. How far back does this go? Samuel said. As far as the records go, Nell said. Possibly further. I can only tell you what the numbers show. Samuel stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her and his hands at his sides. He's been treating my ranch like a supply contract, he said. It came out very quiet. Yes, Nell said. For years. That would be my reading of it. He turned around. His face was controlled, but the set of his jaw and the stillness around his eyes told her there was considerable feeling moving behind it. What do I do? He said. Nothing yet, she said. You don't move against a man like Blackwell with suspicion. You move with evidence. The evidence I need is another few weeks of work. She held his gaze. Can you give me that? He looked at her for a long moment. I've given you 12 years of broken equipment and a barn that needs a new roof, he said. A few more weeks seems like a fair trade. Something shifted into the air between them. Not dramatic, not announced, but there. Like a door that had been standing slightly ajar, moved a few inches in a quiet breeze. All right, Nell said. Then let's talk about the wagon cover. She had already decided by the third week that she needed to be earning revenue rather than merely saving it. The distinction mattered. Saving money stopped the bleeding. Earning money changed the future. And Whitaker Ridge, as she now understood it, completely needed both. The idea had come to her while she was finishing the crown seam repair on the main freight wagon, the one that had been improperly patched 4 times. When she spread the canvas out fully for the final inspection, she realized she was looking at the kind of work that most ranchers in this territory couldn't access without traveling to Topeka or Kansas City. There was no one between Red Willow and the county seat offering professional canvas and leather repair. That was not a gap. That was an opening. She brought it to Samuel that evening with 3 columns of figures written on a piece of brown paper. Current repair costs, current replacement costs, and what a service operation out of the barn would need to charge to be profitable within 6 months. Samuel studied the figures without speaking for a considerable time. You want to run a business, he said. I want to run a business that makes your ranch more than a cattle operation, she said. Cattle prices are unpredictable. Weather is unpredictable. But broken equipment is reliable. People in this territory will always have canvas that needs repairing leather, that needs reinforcing storage, that needs waterproofing. That demand doesn't disappear in a bad year. It gets worse. He looked at the figures again. You'd need more material. I've already priced it, she said. From the Topeka supplier, not Blackwell. The margin is workable. You'd need help. Billy is already learning, she said. And I know 2 women in town, one of them a widow, one married to a man who hasn't worked steady in 2 years, who have good hands and could be trained in 2 weeks to handle the lighter canvas work. I would pay them fairly. Samuel was quiet for a moment. Women. Is that a problem? Nell said. The directness of the question left no comfortable middle ground. No, he said after a pause that was shorter than she expected. No, I don't suppose it is. Good, she said, because they're better candidates than most of the men I've seen attempt this work, and they'll show up on time because they need the income. She had the business in operation by the end of the month. Her first outside customers arrived the same way the Garrett family had, by word of mouth, the slow, reliable telegraph of frontier communities where news moved person to person and reputation was the only advertising that mattered. A homesteader came with a tent that had lost its waterproofing entirely after being stored wet over winter. Nell treated it, resealed every seam, and tested it with a bucket of water before she let it leave the barn. The homesteader paid promptly, told his neighbor, and the neighbor came the following week with a saddle that had cracked through its tree. That one. Nell had to turn away a broken saddle tree was a saddler's work, not canvas repair, but she explained why, and told the man where the nearest competent saddler was, and he left without feeling dismissed because she had given him useful information instead of just a refusal. That mattered. Word traveled about that too. Margaret Shaw arrived on a Thursday morning in the third week of the operation. She had walked 4 miles from her homestead, and she was not interested in pleasantries. "I was told you pay women for skilled work," she said to Nell, standing in the barn doorway with her arms crossed. She was in her 40s, broad-shouldered with the burnt leather complexion of someone who had spent years in open weather. "I want to know if that's true, or if that was talk." "It's true," Nell said. "Do you sew?" "I've been sewing since I was 6 years old," Margaret said. "Heavy canvas leather patching tent repair. My husband ran a freight operation for 8 years. I did his repairs." Nell looked at her hands. The calluses were in the right places. "Show me," Nell said, and handed her a seam ripper and a section of practice canvas. Margaret Shaw made exactly 2 errors in technique. The same 2 errors almost every self-taught canvas worker made, and when Nell corrected her, she adjusted immediately and without argument, which was the thing Nell was actually testing. "I'll pay you a day wage," Nell said. "Fair rate, same as I'd pay any skilled worker. You keep your own hours as long as the work gets done. Can you be here 4 days a week?" "3, Margaret said. "I've got a homestead to maintain." "3 is fine," Nell said. Margaret uncrossed her arms. They shook hands the way people shake hands when they are both clear about what the agreement means, and neither of them has time to waste being imprecise. Billy was already working half his days in the barn by then, and the dynamic that formed between him, Margaret, and Nell had the efficient quality of a crew that knows its own strengths. Billy fast and eager and hungry to learn, Margaret methodical and exacting and intolerant of shortcuts. Nell moving between them with adjustments and decisions, reading the workflow the way she read canvas, finding the weak points before they became failures. The first time Margaret corrected Billy's splice on a grommet line precisely, and without softening the correction, Billy looked at Nell. Nell looked back at him steadily. Billy turned to Margaret and said, "Show me the right way." After that, the 3 of them got along fine. It was during the 5th week that the first of Blackwell's moves arrived. It came in the form of a story, the way that kind of thing usually does. A rancher named Pettifer stopped Samuel on the road into town and mentioned with the elaborate casualness of a man delivering someone else's message that he had heard Nell's repairs were not standing up to weather, that a settler family had returned from the north with a failed canvas after paying for a professional fix. Samuel came home and told Nell what he'd heard. Nell set down the awl she was holding. "What family?" she said. "He didn't say." "What settler?" "He didn't say that either." "What route north?" "What specific failure?" "What date?" Nell's voice was even, but her eyes had gone very focused. "Did Pettifer have a single specific detail, Samuel, or was it a rumor wrapped in neighborly concern?" Samuel was quiet. "It was a rumor," he said. "Yes," Nell said. "It was." She picked up the awl and went back to work. But that evening, she pulled out her repair ledger, the one where she recorded every job, every material used, every technique applied, every customer name and date and condition at delivery, and she went through it from the first entry. Every repair was documented, every material source was listed, every customer had signed or marked the completion record. She had started the ledger on her first day, not because she anticipated being accused of poor work, because she had spent 12 years in a profession where people doubted her work before they saw it, and she had learned early that the only defense against a doubt-based attack is evidence maintained before the doubt arrives. She closed the ledger and put it in the locked box she kept under the workbench. "He's getting nervous," she told Samuel that night. "Blackwell." "Who else?" she said. "A rumor about failed repairs, no specifics delivered through a third party. That's not someone who's heard something true. That's someone manufacturing a concern before there's a real one to manufacture." "What do we do?" Samuel said. "We do what I said before," Nell said. "We work. Every repair that leaves this barn in perfect condition is an argument he can't answer with a story. She looked at him steadily. Arguments defeat arguments, she said. Work defeats rumors. Those are not the same tool. Samuel nodded once the way he nodded when he had understood something and didn't need to say so. The second of Blackwell's moves arrived 8 days later, and this one had edges. A young woman named Clara Hyatt came to the barn asking if Nell was still training workers. She was 22, recently married, with careful eyes and a way of holding herself that suggested she had learned early to take up as little space as possible. Nell said yes and asked what experience she had. Clara had good hands, a precise understanding of basic stitching, and a husband who had told her that morning, according to what she said quietly and without drama, that a wife who worked for wages outside the home was advertising that her husband can't provide. Nell looked at her for a moment. "Do you want to work?" she said. "Yes," Clara said. "Do you understand what I'm offering? Day wages, fair rate, skilled work?" "Yes," Clara said. "Then you're welcome here," Nell said. "What you do with your wages is your business. What you tell your husband about where you're going is your business. What I'll tell you is that the work itself will speak for you better than any argument you could make at home." Clara came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Her husband, Denny Hyatt, showed up at the barn on the third day. He was 26 and big across the shoulders, and his expression when he came through the barn door was the expression of a man who had already decided that this situation was an insult to him and was looking for someone to receive that information. Nell was at the workbench with Margaret and Billy. She did not stop what she was doing. "Mr. Hyatt," she said without turning around because she had heard his boots on the barn floor and recognized the cadence of an agitated man trying to walk with purpose. "Your wife is doing excellent work. She'll be ready to take on independent jobs in another week." He stopped. The prepared speech lost its footing a little. "I came to tell you," he said louder than necessary, "that my wife doesn't need to be here." "That's between you and your wife," Nell said pleasantly, still without turning. "What she does with her own skills is her decision." "She's my wife," Denny Hyatt said. Nell finished the stitch she was on, set down the awl, and turned around. She looked at him the way she looked at a piece of damaged canvas, complete unhurried assessment that left nothing unexamined. "Mr. Hyatt," she said, "your wife has a skill. That skill has value. I'm paying her for that value. The money she earns is hers." She held his eyes. "Now you're welcome to stand in this barn and tell me I'm wrong about that. But I'd point out that you're on Mr. Whitaker's property, and if you'd like to have that conversation, you ought to have it with him." She turned back to the workbench. There was a long silence. From the corner, Margaret Shaw, without looking up from her work, said in a conversational tone, "I've got a splitting maul right here, Mr. Hyatt, if you've come to cut firewood." Billy Turner turned his face away very quickly. Denny Hyatt left. Clara, at the far end of the workbench, kept her eyes on her stitching the entire time. Her hands did not stop moving, but when the barn door closed behind her husband, she let out a breath so quiet that only Nell, standing 2 feet away, heard it. Nell didn't say anything. She picked up her awl and went back to work. But she made sure that afternoon that Clara's wages for the week were paid in full before she went home. That evening Samuel came to the barn after supper and sat on the crate near the door. He did not have a reason as far as Nell could tell. He just sat there while she worked the way a person sits in a room where something good is happening, because the good of it reaches them without requiring them to be part of it. After a while he said, "I heard about Hyatt." "It was nothing," Nell said. "That wasn't nothing," Samuel said. She glanced at him. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, and his expression was not the careful, guarded one she had come to think of as his default. It was open in a way that seemed to cost him something. "My wife," he said, and then he stopped for a moment, deciding something. "My wife Eleanor, my first wife, she wanted to do things beyond the house. She had ideas about keeping books for the ranch, about managing the supply orders herself. She understood numbers better than I did." He was quiet. "I told her she had enough to manage with the household. I told myself I was being practical." Nell kept her hands moving, but gave him the silence he needed. I don't know that she ever forgave me for that, he said. I know I haven't. Samuel, Nell said. He looked up. She knew you loved her, Nell said. Whatever you got wrong, she knew that. He was quiet for a long time. How do you know? He said. Because you're still carrying it, she said simply. People don't carry guilt this heavy about people they treated indifferently. They carry it about the ones that mattered. He looked at her across the lantern light of the barn, and the expression on his face was something she hadn't seen from him yet. Not gratitude, exactly. Not relief, exactly. But the specific look of a man who has been holding a weight alone for so long that he has forgotten what it feels like to set it down, and someone has just reminded him that he is allowed to. He stood up after a moment, straightened his hat, and said, "Good night, Miss Bennett." "Good night, Mr. Whitaker," she said. He was almost to the door when he stopped. "The business," he said without turning around. "What you're building here, it's good." She didn't answer right away. "It will be," she said. "Give it time." He went out into the dark, and Nell sat for a moment, with her hands in her lap, looking at the lantern flame. She was not a woman who had ever expected someone to say that to her. She had expected tolerance at best. She had expected the particular brand of grudging acceptance that comes when someone's usefulness finally outweighs their inconvenience. She had not expected a man to stand in her doorway and say the work was good. She picked up the awl. There was still an hour of light left, and she had harness work to finish. The shift came in the 6th week, and it came from a direction Nell hadn't anticipated. She had been focused on Blackwell on the ledger patterns on building the repair business carefully, and with enough documentation to withstand any challenge. She had been watching the town, and she had been watching the accounts. She had not been watching the community of women. It started with Martha Ingram, a widow of 62, who ran a small kitchen garden on the eastern edge of town and had been subsisting on what it produced, plus a small sum from her daughter in Missouri. Martha came to the barn not to work, but to ask whether the tent she used for her market stall could be saved. It couldn't. The canvas was too far gone. But while she was there, Martha watched Margaret and Clara work for 20 minutes, and something in her face changed, a slow, complicated change that Nell recognized, because she had felt it herself at 24 when she had first walked into the freight workshop in St. Louis, and realized that the work she had been doing in secret, repairing her family's equipment at home because they couldn't afford to pay someone, was an actual skilled profession that actual people got paid for. "Could a woman my age learn that?" Martha said. "What's your age got to do with it?" Nell said. Martha looked at her. "I'm serious," Nell said. "Can your hands still hold a needle?" Martha held up her hands. They were arthritic at 2 knuckles on the left, but the fingers were steady. "The heavy canvas work would be hard for you," Nell said honestly. "But the lighter leather stitching and the grommet work that you could do, I'd train you. It'd take 3 weeks to get you to a standard I'd pay wages for." Martha Ingram was quiet for a long moment. "My daughter keeps telling me to come live with her," she said. "She means well, but I don't want to be someone's burden." "Then come learn to work," Nell said. Martha started the following Monday. After Martha, there was Ruth Paley, who was married, but whose husband had been ill for 2 years and could no longer work a full day's labor, and Ruth had 3 children and a homestead, and was running out of time before she ran out of options. After Ruth came a young Comanche woman named Saya, who had grown up working leather in a tradition that Nell recognized immediately as technically superior to most of what she had learned in the St. Louis workshop, and who could do things with sinew thread and hide preparation that made Margaret Shaw stop in the middle of her own work and watch in open appreciation. Saya did not say much. She worked with the precision of someone who has never in her life had the luxury of imprecision. Nell paid her the same rate as everyone else, and when a ranch hand made a comment in the yard one morning about the company Nell was keeping, Samuel walked out of the barn where he had just happened to be standing and said in a very quiet voice, "That woman works for this ranch. You want to stay on this ranch, you'll treat her accordingly." The comment did not recur. By the 7th week, there were 7 women working in the barn on a rotating basis. The revenue was coming in steadily. Nell had built a system: intake assessment, material requirements, labor assignment, quality check, delivery payment, that ran with the efficiency of the St. Louis workshop, adapted for the barn's constraints and the territory's materials. The ranch felt different. Not dramatically different. No speeches, no declarations, no moment of transformation. Just the accumulative difference of a place where things were being cared for properly, where the equipment was sound, and the accounts were honest, and the people working the land believed the land had a future. Samuel noticed it in the way he moved through his own property, less like a man trying to keep water from draining through his hands, and more like a man who had remembered that the land was his, that it was worth something, that it was worth fighting for. He started repairing the barn roof. He did it himself, working evenings after the cattle work was done, with Billy helping when Billy wasn't in the barn with Nell. It took 2 weeks. The roof held the first big autumn rain without a single leak. He came and told Nell about it. She was at the workbench. She did not stop working. But she looked at him sideways with those gray eyes, and the corner of her mouth moved in what might, on a more demonstrative woman, have been a full smile. "Good bones," she said. He stood there for a moment. "You've been saying that since you got here," he said. "Because it's true," she said, "and because you needed to hear it until you believed it." He sat down on the crate near the door. His crate, it had become the one where he sat in the evening sometimes, and let the sound of the work move around him without demanding anything from him. "Nell," he said. She looked up. "I want you to know," he said, "that when this operation is on solid ground, when the debt is manageable, and the business is established, I intend to speak to you about this arrangement becoming something more permanent." Nell held his gaze. "I appreciate you telling me," she said. "That's all," he said. "For now," she said. "Ask me again when the barn roof doesn't leak." He looked at the ceiling. "The barn roof doesn't leak," he said. "Ask me again when you're sure," she said. He stood up, and he was trying not to smile, and failing somewhat, and he put his hat on and said goodnight, and went back to the house, and Nell went back to work. But she sat for a moment first, with her hands still in her lap, and the lantern burning steady in the dark of the barn, and she let herself feel just briefly the particular warmth of being somewhere you have begun to belong. Not because someone had told her she belonged, not because anyone had granted her a place, but because she had built it. With her hands, with her judgment, with her work, with the slow accumulated weight of days spent doing what she was actually capable of, rather than what anyone had imagined her to be. Outside, the wind was picking up. Nell felt it change in the air even before it moved the barn door, a shift in pressure, a drop in temperature, the particular quality of autumn wind that carries something harder behind it. She looked at the canvas inventories stacked along the far wall. There was a lot of work ahead of them. And somewhere in Red Willow, she knew without being told, Horace Blackwell was sitting in his comfortable store and recalculating the size of the problem she had become. She put another log on the small stove in the corner, tightened the lantern wick, and kept working. The wind Nell had felt changing that night was the edge of something larger. She knew it by morning. The temperature had dropped hard overnight, and the sky had the particular flat gray quality that old-timers in Kansas called a liar sky calm on the surface, carrying everything underneath. Amos Reed said it first standing in the yard with his coffee before sunrise. "Storm's coming," he said. "Big one. 3 days, maybe 4. "How long before it hits?" Nell asked. "Tomorrow evening if we're lucky," he said. "Tonight if we're not." Nell went straight to the barn. She pulled every canvas inventory from the storage racks and checked each one, not for repair quality, which she already knew, but for positioning. Which tarps were covering what? Which wagon covers were on which wagons? Which storage tents were bearing real load weight and which were sitting empty? Billy found her there 20 minutes later. "What do you need?" he said without any preamble. "I need you to move the north grain storage to the secondary barn before noon," she said. "The tarp on the north side has one section I haven't gotten to yet. It'll hold light rain, but not a serious storm." Billy went. Margaret arrived an hour later with Clara and Ruth behind her. None of them had been sent for. They had simply read the sky the same way Nell had, and come anyway, which told Nell something important about what the last 6 weeks had built among them. "Tell us what to move," Margaret said. They worked through the morning in organized motion, assessing repositioning, reinforcing testing. Nell moved from task to task with the focused efficiency of someone who has run emergency preparations before calling decisions fast and trusting the people she had trained to execute them without detailed supervision. At 11 o'clock, a wagon came up the ranch road. It was a railroad wagon. She recognized the livery on the side panel, and it was driven by a man she had not seen before, heavyset and businesslike, with a railroad company tag on his coat. "I'm looking for a Miss Bennett," he said. "Nell Bennett." "That's me," she said. He looked at her with the brief recalibrating expression she had stopped taking personally months ago. "Name's Hadley," he said. "Logistics foreman for the Central Kansas Railroad construction camp. We've set up 3 miles east of Red Willow." He glanced at the barn behind her. "I was told you do canvas and leather repair." "I do," she said. "We've got a camp of 260 men," he said. "We've got 43 tents in various conditions, plus harness equipment, wagon covers, and storage tarps. Most of it's been in the field for 8 months. He paused. "I was also told your pricing is fair and your work is sound. I need to know if that's true before I bring the work to you, because our foreman will not accept repairs that don't hold. Your foreman is welcome to inspect anything that leaves this barn before he accepts it," Nell said. "And if something I repair fails in the field through a flaw in my work, rather than in the material or the handling, I repair it again at no charge. That's my standing practice." Hadley looked at her steadily. "When can you come look at the camp?" he said. "I'll ride out this afternoon," she said, "after I finish securing this yard for the storm." He nodded satisfied, in the way practical men are satisfied by practical answers, and drove back down the road. Margaret appeared at Nell's shoulder before the wagon dust had settled. "Railroad contract," Margaret said flatly. "Possibly," Nell said. "We have to see the work first." "How much work?" "Enough to change everything," Nell said, "if we can handle it." She kept moving. The railroad camp was exactly what Nell expected, and considerably worse than the foreman had described. She rode out with Billy at 2 o'clock, and within 10 minutes of walking through the camp, she had identified 17 urgent repairs, 11 moderate ones, and 4 complete failures waiting to happen. The dining tent alone had a grommet line in the east wall that was carrying triple its designed load, because someone had compensated for a failed stake line by cinching the grommets tighter instead of replacing the stakes. The camp's maintenance man, a young fellow named DeVries, who had been doing his best with wrong materials and insufficient training, followed her through the assessment with the expression of a man who is learning with each step how much he did not know. "This grommet line," Nell said, stopping at the east wall of the dining tent. "When did this get reconfigured?" 2 weeks ago, DeVries said. "Stake wouldn't hold in the ground, So, you transferred the load to the fabric," Nell said. "I can see that. How many full camp dinners have gone through this tent since then?" "Everyone," DeVries said quietly. 260 men, Nell said. "Yes, ma'am." She pressed her palm flat against the wall fabric above the overtaxed grommet and felt the tension vibrating in it like a held breath. "If that storm hits tonight," she said, "you'll lose this tent with men inside it." The silence that followed was the silence of a man who has just understood that a problem he thought was inconvenient is actually dangerous. "How fast can you fix it?" DeVries said. "Today," Nell said, "before I leave." She sent Billy back to the ranch for materials while she continued the full assessment, writing everything in her repair ledger with the date, the specific failure type, and the estimated labor and material cost. She numbered them in order of risk: immediate danger, first structural degradation, second maintenance, and longevity. Third, the railroad's foreman Nathaniel Price arrived while she was finishing the assessment. He was 45 years old and wore his authority the way men do when they have earned it rather than inherited it, without drama, without announcement. He looked at her ledger when she offered it. He read it the way a serious man reads a serious document completely without skimming. "You found the dining tent grommet problem," he said. "It's the most urgent item," she said. "I'm repairing it today before I leave." He looked up from the ledger. "My maintenance man missed that," he said. "Your maintenance man is working with the wrong thread grade and no waterproofing compound," Nell said. "He's doing what he can with what he has. It's not a failure of skill, it's a failure of supply." Price looked at her for a moment. "What would a full repair contract look like?" he said. "I have 7 trained workers and a barn set up as a professional workshop," she said. "I can handle your priority repairs on site, the things that are dangerous or urgent, and take everything else to the barn. I'd want a 4-week trial contract with defined deliverables so you can assess the work before you commit to anything longer." "And your price?" She named it. He didn't flinch, which told her the number was fair. "You'll start with the dining tent today," he said. "I've already started," she said. He almost smiled. 4-week trial, he said. "Starting Monday." They shook hands, and Nell went to repair the grommet line, and the wind was already picking up from the northwest when she finished and rode back to Whitaker Ridge with Billy beside her, and the sky pressing lower with every mile. The storm came faster than Amos had predicted. It hit just before midnight. Not with the slow build of a prairie rain, but with the sudden enormous force of a Kansas autumn system that had been gathering strength for 300 miles of open country and had finally found something to hit. Nell was awake. She had not tried to sleep. She sat in the barn with a lantern and her ledger and listened to the rain hammer the roof, and she was pleased in the deep bones way of someone whose work is being tested that the roof did not leak. Samuel's 2 weeks of evening repairs held through every gust. Not a single drip. The grain storage held. The equipment held. Every tarp she had repositioned and reinforced that morning held. In the morning, when the storm had passed and the yard was wet and the light was thin and gray and honest, Nell walked the property with Samuel and Amos and made the damage list. It was short. 1 fence section in the south pasture already weakened before she had arrived. 1 outbuilding door that had been hung wrong for years and had finally let go of its upper hinge. The kitchen garden was flattened, but that was weather, not failure. Samuel walked beside her and did not say much. When they finished the circuit and came back to the yard, he stopped and looked at the barn, the new roof, the organized storage, the rebuilt workbench visible through the open door, and then he looked at Nell. "I've been through a dozen storms on this property," he said. "This is the first one I haven't lost something I couldn't afford to lose." Nell didn't answer. She wrote the fence repair on her list, but she felt it quietly, the way she felt things that mattered, the way a seam holds when you've done it right and the load comes on and the thread grips and doesn't give. That feeling, the rightness of work that has done what it was designed to do. The railroad camp was a different story. News reached them by mid-morning. The camp had lost 1 tent completely. A supply storage tent on the west side, and 3 others had partial failures requiring immediate attention. DeVries sent a rider to Nell before breakfast had been cleared. She was already loading her tool roll onto the wagon when the rider arrived. "Tell him I'll be there by 10, she said. Billy and Margaret came with her. The supply tent was a write-off. The canvas had failed at 3 seams simultaneously in the wind, and when 3 seams go at once, you are not repairing a tent, you are building a new one. Nell said so plainly to DeVries, who looked pained but did not argue. "The other 3, she said, moving to the next one. "These I can fix today." She and her team worked through the morning in the camp, while 260 railroad men moved around them in the careful way that working people respect other working people in the middle of a job. Nobody bothered them. Nobody made comments. 2 men held canvas sections without being asked because they could see it would help. At noon, Price came to find her. "The supply tent," he said. "Total replacement," she said. "I can source the canvas and construct a replacement in the barn. 8 days. 5, he said. 7, she said. 8 was honest. 7 is what happens if my team works Sundays. 5 is what happens if you want corners cut and you don't want corners cut. He looked at her for a moment. 7, he said. And I want to see the material before you cut it. You're welcome to, she said. They walked the remaining damaged tents together, and Nell explained each repair as she planned it, and Price asked precise questions and received precise answers, and by the end of it, they were operating with the comfortable efficiency of two professionals who have identified each other as competent and are getting on with the work. It was at the edge of the camp near the equipment storage that Nell found the thread. She had pulled a section of failed seam from the collapsed supply tent and was examining it by daylight, identifying the thread grade, checking the wax coating, determining whether the failure was construction-based or material-based. She held the thread up against the light. It was wrong, not slightly wrong. Fundamentally wrong. The thread was a lightweight general-purpose grade, unwaxed, the kind sold for household sewing. It had no business being anywhere near structural canvas. A tent seam stitched with this thread was not a tent seam. It was a delay. Where does your maintenance supply come from? Nell asked DeVries, who was standing nearby. Blackwell's store in town, he said. Same as everything else in the camp. Nell looked at the thread. Who placed the last supply order? She said. Mr. Price's secretary handles the supply accounts, but the local purchasing goes through the store directly. Blackwell's man comes out twice a week. Nell folded the thread section and put it in her coat pocket. She did not say anything else about it then. She finished the assessment, confirmed the repair schedule with Price, and rode back to the ranch with Billy and Margaret, and she did not speak much on the road. Billy glanced at her twice but knew better than to push. It was Margaret who finally said from the back of the wagon, "You found something?" "Yes," Nell said. "What?" "I'm not certain yet," Nell said. "I need to check something first." She went straight to her supply cabinet when they got back to the barn. She had a collection of thread samples, every grade she worked with labeled and dated, and she pulled the one she had purchased from Callaway's store, at the start, the correct waxed canvas thread, and held it next to the section she had taken from the failed camp tent. They were not even close. Someone had supplied the railroad camp with household sewing thread at canvas thread prices. The thread had come from Blackwell's store. Nell sat with that for a long moment, feeling the weight of what it meant arrange itself in her mind like pieces of a repair problem, each piece finding its place, the full picture assembling. Blackwell had been supplying inferior materials to the railroad camp while telling them they were buying professional grade. When the materials failed, as this thread had failed, as it had been designed to fail by being the wrong thing entirely, the failures would be attributed to poor construction, to weather, to the harsh conditions of a working camp. And every failure created a replacement order, which came from Blackwell's store. It was the same logic as the ranch, the same pattern scaled up to a railroad operation. Feed failure into the system. Profit from the replacement. Ensure the repair option is discredited before it can interrupt the cycle. Except now, there was something different. Now, there was Nell. She brought the thread samples to Samuel that evening, both of them laid side by side on the kitchen table, and she showed him the difference without saying a word about what she was going to do next. Samuel looked at the samples. He looked at her face. "This is what failed in the tent," he said. "Yes." "And it came from Blackwell." "Yes." "Nell," he said slowly, "if you take this to Price." "I know," she said. "Blackwell will know immediately that it came from you. He'll know you have evidence. He'll move." "I know," she said again. "Then why?" "Because 260 men are living under tents made with this thread," she said quietly. "And the next storm won't give them a 7-day warning." Samuel was quiet. He looked at the thread on the table. He looked at her. "How do you want to do this?" he said. She brought the evidence to Nathaniel Price the next morning. She did not go alone. Samuel came with her, and she had asked DeVries to be present, and she laid both thread samples on Price's work table, with her repair ledger open to the entry, showing the supply date and source for every material she had used in the camp's repairs. Price picked up the two threads. He held them side by side. The color of his face changed. "How long has this been in the camp?" he said very quietly. Based on the seam construction in the failed tent, at least 8 weeks, Nell said. Possibly longer. Price set the threads down. He was quiet for a full 30 seconds, and the quality of that silence was the quality of a man assembling a very large, very serious set of facts and deciding what to do with them. "De Vries," he said. "Sir?" "Pull every supply receipt from Blackwell's going back 3 months." "Yes, sir. Every receipt," Price said. "Every line item. I want it on this table by 4 o'clock." De Vries left at something close to a run. Price looked at Nell. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain of what the evidence shows," she said. "I'm not in the business of claiming more than I can demonstrate. But I can demonstrate this." She pointed to the thread comparison. Household-grade thread in a structural canvas application will fail under load. It failed here. The thread came from Blackwell's store and was billed, I would wager, as canvas grade. That's what your receipts will tell you. Price picked up his hat. "I'll need your repair ledger," he said. "As a comparison record, can you leave it with me?" Nell had anticipated this. She had stayed up until midnight making a full copy. She placed the original on the table. "Take whatever time you need," she said. They rode back to the ranch, and Samuel did not try to make conversation, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him most, his understanding of when words were the wrong tool. At the ranch, she told the team what had happened. Not everything, not the strategic implications, not Blackwell's probable response, but the facts. The failed thread, the evidence, the conversation with Price. Margaret listened with her arms crossed and her jaw set. "He's going to come after the barn now," she said. "Yes," Nell said. "What do we do?" "We work," Nell said. "We document everything. We make sure there is not a single repair that leaves this barn without a complete record attached to it. And we keep our prices fair and our quality absolute." Clara said quietly, "What if people believe him instead of us?" "Some will," Nell said. "That's how it works when one man has been the loudest voice in a county for a long time. But the work speaks too, and work is louder than talk over time." She met each of their eyes. "Keep working," she said. "That's the answer. It is always the answer." Blackwell's response came faster than Nell expected, and harder. 3 days after she had presented the thread evidence to Price, a rider came to the barn from town with a message from the owner of the hardware store on Main Street, a man named Cooper, who had no stake in the matter, but was relaying information because his wife had bought her first wages from Nell's operation, and he considered that to make Nell a neighbor. The message was this: Blackwell had spent the previous evening at the Red Willow Saloon speaking to every rancher and businessman he could find, and the story he was telling was that the tent collapse at the railroad camp had been caused by Nell's repairs, that she had used inferior materials, that she had overcharged for substandard work, and that Samuel Whitaker had brought a dishonest woman into the county who was now poisoning the supply chain with bad workmanship and incompetent management. Nell read the message twice. Billy was watching her face. "Bad," he said. "It's exactly what I expected," she said, which was not the same as saying it didn't hurt, but she had learned a long time ago not to confuse those two things. "What do we do?" Clara said. "Nothing different," Nell said. "Not yet." But she could see in the faces around her that this answer was harder to accept than it had been before. Because this was not a rumor without specifics. This was a named accusation attached to a real event being told to people who made real business decisions based on what they heard. Amos appeared in the barn doorway before she had to say anything more. "Got a visitor," he said. "From the railroad." Her stomach tightened. She kept her face steady. She walked out to the yard. It was not Price. It was a man she hadn't seen before, older, better dressed, with the particular polished edge of a man who works from an office rather than a field. He had a company pin on his lapel. "Miss Bennett," he said. "I'm Robert Callum, Regional Director for Central Kansas Railroad." "Mr. Callum," she said. "I've come about the tent collapse," he said. "I understand you hold a repair contract with our foreman." "A trial contract," she said. "Yes, And I understand, he said, that certain repairs to that tent were completed by your team. The east wall grommet line was repaired on the day I assessed the camp, she said, 8 days before the storm. That repair held through the storm and was intact afterward. I have documentation of every item I touched and every item I did not touch. I'd invite you to see it. He studied her for a moment. The failed section, she said before he could speak again. Would you like me to tell you specifically which seams failed and what material was used in their original construction, because I have that documented too? A beat of silence. Yes, he said. I would. She brought him into the barn and opened her ledger and showed him the assessment entry from the day she had walked the camp, every item noted, numbered, and categorized by urgency. She showed him where the supply tent fell on that list, not urgent, scheduled for standard repair. She showed him the seam failure entry from the storm inspection with the specific thread sample she had pulled from the failed section. Then she put the 2 thread samples side by side on the workbench. He picked them up. He was quiet for a long time. Where did this come from? He said, holding up the inferior thread. The receipts you'll have from Blackwell's store will show you, she said. What I can tell you is that it did not come from this barn. Callum set the threads down carefully. He looked at the ledger. He looked at the workbench. He looked at the 7 women and 2 men working steadily around them, because Nell had said nothing to stop the work while this conversation happened, because the work itself was part of the answer. Your contract is not canceled, he said. Nell kept her expression level. Thank you. But I want weekly reports from this point forward, he said. Every repair documented, every material sourced. I've been doing that since day 1, she said. You're welcome to the previous reports as well. He left. Margaret waited exactly until the wagon had cleared the gate before she said in a voice that was not entirely steady, He was going to cancel it. He considered it, Nell said. What changed his mind? The ledger, Nell said, and the thread, and the fact that we were still working while he questioned us. She looked around at her team. A guilty person stops working when someone investigates them. They make explanations and gestures. We just kept working because there was nothing to hide. Ruth said quietly, What happens to Blackwell now? That's Price's territory, Nell said. And the railroads. We've given them what we found. What they do with it is their decision. She closed the ledger. Get back to the supply tent construction, she said. We've got 7 days and we're 2 behind. They went back to work. But the atmosphere in the barn had shifted. Not broken, nothing close to broken, but altered in the way that things alter when people understand that the danger is real and the fight is not abstract. Samuel came in that evening and stood near his crate, and he did not sit down this time. Callum was here, he said. I know, Nell said. The whole town is going to hear Blackwell's version before they hear ours, he said. Yes, she said. And when they do, Samuel, she said, and her voice was calm, but with an edge he had not heard in it before. I know what's coming. I've known since I found that thread. I'm not asking you to pretend it isn't serious. It is serious. He was quiet. But I need you, she said, to trust the work, not the arguments, not the countering of rumors, not the confrontations in the saloon. The work. I do trust the work, he said. I'm not sure the town does. The town will follow the evidence, she said. People always say they won't, and then they do, because at the end of the day, a wagon cover that holds is more persuasive than anything either Blackwell or I could say about it. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. You're the steadiest person I've ever known, he said. It came out quietly the way things come out when they are true, before they are considered. Nell kept her eyes on her work. I'm not steady, she said. I'm just very experienced at not showing the places where I'm not. He stood there for another moment. Nell, he said. Samuel. Whatever comes next, he said. I'm beside you in it. She looked at him then, directly without deflection. I know, she said. I knew that before you said it. And that was more from Nell Bennett than most people got. Outside, the first riders from town were already spreading Blackwell's story to every ranch and homestead within 20 miles, and the clock on everything Nell had built was running in a way it had not run before. But in the barn, the work continued. The supply tent canvas lay across 3 work tables measured and marked and ready to cut, and Nell picked up her shears and made the first clean stroke through the heavy material, because the only answer she had ever known that was truly unassailable was a thing built so well that no story, however well circulated, could make it fall. And then, on a Tuesday morning, 10 days later, Horace Blackwell drove his wagon up the road to Whitaker Ridge himself. He came with a lawyer Nell had never seen, a land assessor she recognized from town, and a leather document case that he carried with the deliberate weight of a man who has been saving a particular card for a specific moment. He stepped down from the wagon. He looked at the barn. He looked at the women working inside it. He looked at the ranch hands standing in the yard. And then he looked at Nell, who had walked out to meet him, and his expression was not angry and was not surprised. It was satisfied. "Miss Bennett," he said, "is Mr. Whitaker available?" "I'm here," Samuel said, coming from the house. Blackwell nodded pleasantly. "Good," he said. "I've come about a debt." He opened the document case and laid a paper on the wagon's running board. "Your father borrowed $400 from my predecessor in this county in 1871, he said. "That note changed hands twice. I purchased it 8 months ago." He looked at Samuel. "With accumulated interest at the contracted rate, the current balance owed is $900. Samuel's face did not change, not a muscle. "That note is due," Blackwell said, "in 60 days. The yard was completely silent. $900. 60 days. Nell looked at the document. She looked at Samuel. She looked at the land assessor, who was already writing something in his notebook. And she understood with the complete cold clarity of someone who has just seen the full shape of a problem she had been looking at from the wrong angle that this was not a new development. This was the plan. Everything else, the rumors, the inferior thread, the campaign against her reputation. It was not Blackwell fighting her because she was a threat. It was Blackwell keeping her occupied while he waited for the right moment to use a weapon he had been holding for 8 months. She had been watching the wrong hand. "Well," Blackwell said, and he picked up the document and tucked it back into the case, with the precision of a man who has enjoyed this moment in his imagination many times and finds the reality satisfying. "I'll expect payment or the appropriate legal proceedings will begin." He looked at Nell one more time. "Resourceful woman, you married Whitaker," he said. "Shame it won't be enough." He climbed back onto the wagon, and Nell stood in the yard of Whitaker Ridge in the autumn light with 60 days to raise $900, and she looked at the barn her team had built, and the roof Samuel had repaired, and the supply tent canvas waiting inside, and she did not feel panic. She felt the specific clarifying cold of a woman who has just identified the exact problem she needs to solve. She turned to Samuel. "Come inside," she said. "We need to look at the numbers." They sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight. Samuel laid out every account book, every receipt, every contract document he owned, and Nell went through each one with the focused, unhurried attention she brought to every serious problem, not rushing, not panicking, reading the numbers, the way she read damaged canvas, looking for the truth of the thing beneath the surface presentation. The truth was not good. The current repair contract with the railroad would pay approximately $340 over its remaining term, assuming no disputes and full completion. The ranch cattle income before winter would bring in another $160 at current market prices, maybe $180 if they were lucky with the late-season buyers. Nell's barn operation had $70 in outstanding invoices not yet collected and another $40 in confirmed upcoming work from 2 homesteader families who had already agreed to terms. Total somewhere between $610 and $630. Against $900. The gap was not catastrophic, but it was real, and it was not going to close by itself in 60 days. Samuel sat across from her with his hands flat on the table and looked at the numbers without speaking. "Say it," Nell said. "I have breeding stock," he said, My father's last Hereford bull and 2 of the cows. I've been holding them back because they're the foundation of rebuilding the herd. If I sell them, how much at 200? Maybe 220 if I find the right buyer. Nell looked at the numbers. 220 added to 630 brought them to 850. Still $50 short of the principal, and she had not yet calculated the final interest accumulation to the payment date. "Don't sell them yet," she said. "Nell." "Not yet," she said. "Give me 3 days to look at this from another angle." He held her gaze across the table, and she could see the exhaustion in him, not just tonight's exhaustion, but the accumulated exhaustion of a man who has been fighting a losing battle for 4 years and has just discovered the fight was designed to be unwinnable. 3 days, he said. She went to the barn at 5 in the morning, not to work, to think. She sat on the crate near the door. Samuel's crate, which she had started thinking of as the thinking place, and she looked at the supply tent canvas spread across the work tables, and she let her mind move through the problem the way she moved through a repair assessment. Systematic. Without assumption. Starting from what was true. What was true, the railroad camp needed the supply tent completed in 5 days. What was true after the supply tent, there was a full winter maintenance schedule that no one had yet contracted for because the camp's attention had been on the storm damage and the threat investigation. What was true, 260 men would be in that camp through January, and every piece of canvas and leather equipment they owned would need winter treatment to survive the season. She had seen this problem before. At the St. Louis Freight Workshop every autumn brought the same challenge equipment that had survived summer work. Needed systematic winter preparation, and the companies that did it properly saved enormous replacement costs. The following spring, and the companies that did not do it ended up in March with failed gear and emergency orders. The railroad camp had not contracted for winter maintenance. Nobody had offered it to them. Nell went back to the house. She woke Samuel at 6:30, which was later than either of them usually slept, but she had let him rest because what she was about to propose was going to require him to trust her further than she had asked him to trust her yet. He was in the kitchen already, coffee on, looking like he had not slept much anyway. "I need to go to Topeka," she said. He looked at her over his coffee. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I need to speak to the railroad supply director directly, not Price the director, the man who signs the large contracts." "What are you going to propose?" "A winter maintenance contract," she said. "Full seasonal treatment for every canvas and leather item in the camp. Waterproofing, seam reinforcement, grommet inspection, harness, conditioning, storage preparation. It's work that needs doing and nobody has offered to do it. I'm going to offer." Samuel set down his coffee cup. "That's not a barn operation," he said. "That's a full commercial contract." "Yes," she said. "You'd need more workers." "I have them," she said. "Margaret, Clara, Ruth, Sia, Martha, and Annie Walker, if her husband doesn't interfere. Billy on the heavy work. That's 8 people. I can run 3 teams. The materials alone would cost—" "I've already priced it," she said. "The Topeka supplier can have a full order to us within a week if I place it tomorrow." She held his gaze. The contract value at fair rates for work of this scale would be between $350 and $400, combined with everything else we have that closes the gap. Samuel was very still. "And if the director says no," he said. "Then we're where we are now," she said. "But he won't say no, Samuel, because nobody else is going to walk in and offer him this. The camp needs it. I can do it. That's a contract that writes itself." He looked at her for a long moment. "When do you need to leave?" 7 tomorrow morning, she said. "I'll be back by Thursday evening." He nodded. "I'll have Amos hitch the good wagon," he said. She almost said thank you. She said something better. "I know," she said. "I know you will." She told the team that afternoon. She told them everything. The debt, the 60-day deadline, the numbers, the Topeka plan. Because she had learned in the St. Louis workshop that the fastest way to destroy a team's trust was to protect them from the truth of their situation. Margaret sat with her arms crossed and her jaw tight. Clara looked at the work table. Ruth closed her eyes briefly, the way a woman does when she is counting what she can and cannot afford to have fail. It was Saya who spoke first. "What do we need to finish by Thursday?" she said. Nell looked at her. "The supply tent," she said. "Completely finished, inspected, and delivered." "Then we work nights," Saya said simply. Margaret uncrossed her arms. "I'll bring food." Billy said, "I'll stay." Clara said, "Me too." Nell stood in her barn, surrounded by women who had come to her with nothing but skill and need, and the willingness to be taught. And she felt something she did not have a clean word for, not pride exactly, not gratitude exactly, but the thing that lives in the space where those two feelings overlap. "All right," she said. "Let's get to work." They worked through Tuesday night and all of Wednesday. Nell left for Topeka on Thursday morning with the supply tent completed, inspected, double-checked, and loaded on the delivery wagon Billy would take to the camp. The road to Topeka was 6 hours each way, and Nell spent most of it thinking through the presentation, not rehearsing speeches, which she had never found useful, but making sure she had accurate command of every number, every specification, every logistical detail she might be asked about. The railroad's regional supply office was in a 3-story building near the freight depot. The director's name was Harlan Webb, and he kept her waiting for 45 minutes, which she spent sitting straight-backed in the corridor, doing arithmetic in her head. When Webb finally received her, he was a compact man in his 50s, with the fast eyes of someone who processes information quickly and dismisses what he considers irrelevant even faster. He looked at her with the assessment she knew by heart. She did not give him time to decide how to categorize her. "Mr. Webb," she said, "I'm going to take 12 minutes of your time. At the end of 12 minutes, if you're not interested, I'll leave without requiring anything further. Fair." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She laid out the proposal in 9 minutes. She had the numbers written on 2 sheets of paper materials. Costs, labor costs, timeline deliverables, and the projected savings to the railroad in spring replacement costs versus the contract price. She had the comparison figures from St. Louis freight companies that had adopted systematic winter maintenance programs versus those that had not. She had her repair ledger with Price's ongoing assessment notes written in the margin in Price's own hand. Webb picked up the ledger. He turned pages. He stopped at the thread comparison section where Nell had documented the inferior supply materials alongside her own, and he read that page twice. "Price told me about this," he said. "The supply investigation is between your company and Blackwell's store," Nell said. "My concern is the work. The maintenance contract is a separate matter. I'm offering it because the need exists, and I'm in a position to fulfill it." Webb looked at the projections page. "You can genuinely handle a contract this size," he said. "I can handle it, or I'll tell you I can't," she said. "I don't propose work I'm not certain of." He looked at her. 8 workers, he said. 8 trained workers, she said. 3 teams running in rotation. Full documentation on every item treated. Timeline. 6 weeks for full camp inventory, she said. I can have a preliminary report on the first 20 items within 10 days of contract signing. Webb set the ledger down. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. I'll give you a 4-week initial agreement, he said. If the work and reporting are as described, I'll extend to the full 6 weeks automatically. The contract value for the full 6 weeks at the rates they agreed was $380. Nell rode back to Red Willow with the signed agreement in her coat pocket, and the particular sensation of someone who has just lifted a load and found it exactly as heavy as they calculated, no more, no less. The wagon pulled into Whitaker Ridge just after dark on Thursday. Samuel was on the porch. He looked at her face as she climbed down, and he read the answer before she said a word. You got it, he said. I got it, she said. He let out a breath, not a dramatic breath, just the quiet release of a man who has been holding something very tight for several days. Come inside, he said. There's supper. She went inside, and she sat at his kitchen table, and she ate the meal he had kept warm for her, and they went through the numbers together. Final time. Complete picture every source of income against the debt and the deadline. They were still short, not by much, $70 accounting for final interest. But $70 was $70, and it was real. Samuel said, "The breeding stock." "Not yet," Nell said. He looked at her. "Nell, we've tried every—" "I need to ask the railroad for an advance," she said. The silence was considerable. "Against a contract you just signed," Samuel said slowly. "Against confirmed work," she said. "A portion of the contract value prepaid with the remainder delivered on the standard schedule." She held his gaze. "It's not unusual in commercial contract work. I've seen it done in St. Louis. The risk to the railroad is covered by the work already in progress, and Price trusts the work. If they say no," Samuel said, "you've shown a creditor that we are short. If they say no," Nell said, "we sell the breeding stock and we're done, but I want to try this first." She could see in his face the thing she had seen in it since almost the beginning, the calculation of how much hope to allow himself the careful management of a man who has been disappointed enough times to be afraid of wanting something too directly. "It's a risk," he said. "It's a measured risk," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her across the table. "Is that something you say to yourself?" he said. "When you have to do something frightening?" She considered that. "Yes," she said honestly. "Every time." He was quiet for a moment. "Ask them," he said. She sent the request to Price by Ryder the next morning. Formal, professional, precisely worded, asking for a 20% advance against the confirmed contract on the basis of work already delivered and in progress. Then she went to work, because that was the only answer she had, and she was not going to stop giving it. The next 10 days were the hardest of any Nell had spent at Whitaker Ridge. The winter maintenance contract ran alongside the final railroad repair schedule, which meant her team was working at full capacity every day in cold that crept deeper as November settled in. Hands cracked. Tools grew stiff. The barn stove burned continuously, and still the air at the work tables was cold enough to see breath. Nobody complained. Margaret had a particular silence she brought to difficult working conditions, not grim, but focused, economical, the silence of someone who is saving every resource for the task. Clara worked with a precision that had become extraordinary in 2 months of daily practice. Ruth, whose hands were the most affected by the cold, wrapped them in cloth between tasks, and did not mention it unless asked directly. Saya brought something from her own tradition that proved invaluable, a method of conditioning heavy leather in cold temperatures using rendered fat and careful heat application that maintained flexibility where standard oil treatments were failing. She showed it to Nell without being asked, and Nell adopted it immediately and incorporated it into the winter maintenance protocol. "This is better than what I was doing," Nell told her. "My grandmother taught it to me," Saya said. "Then your grandmother was a better craftsman than my instructor," Nell said. Saya's expression was very still for a moment. Then she said, "She was the best I've ever known." Annie Walker came by on the 7th day of the maintenance contract. She was 19, small and quick-eyed, the daughter of a homesteader family 2 miles east, and she had been watching the barn operation since the 2nd week, with the transparent hunger of someone who wants very much to be part of a thing but hasn't found the door yet. Nell had been watching her watch. "You sew?" Nell said when Annie appeared at the barn door. "Yes, ma'am," Annie said. "Everything my mother knows, and I can do leather work. I fixed my father's saddlebags twice." "Come in," Nell said. "Show me." Annie's hands were extraordinary, fast and accurate in a way that some people are born with and others spend years trying to develop. She made one error in the assessment piece Nell gave her, and when Nell pointed it out, Annie looked at it and immediately understood not just what she had done wrong, but why. That was the rarest thing. "Can you start tomorrow?" Nell said. "Yes, ma'am," Annie said. "Your parents." "My mother knows," Annie said. "She says to tell you she's proud someone is teaching this work." Nell brought Annie into the team rotation the next day, and by the end of her first week, Annie was keeping pace with Clara on the lighter canvas work and learning the leather conditioning method from Saya, with a speed that made even Margaret, who was not easily impressed, nod approval. It was during Annie's second week that Price's response arrived. It came by rider mid-morning. Nell was at the work table. She accepted the envelope without looking at it, set it on the workbench, and finished the seam she was on before she opened it. She had learned a long time ago not to let a letter interrupt good work. The team was watching without watching. She unfolded the letter. Price had approved the advance. $75 prepaid against the confirmed contract deliverable to Whitaker Ridge by the following Friday. She read the letter a second time. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She picked up her awl. "Well," Margaret said. "We're all right," Nell said. The barn went very quiet for a moment. Then Ruth made a sound that was not quite a word, just a release of air, compressed and relieved, and Clara covered her face with both hands for 3 seconds, and then took them down and went back to work. And Margaret turned back to her table, with a set to her jaw that might in different light have been a smile. Billy said from across the barn, "Does Mr. Whitaker know?" "Not yet," Nell said. "But he will tonight." She told Samuel that evening. She put the letter on the table in front of him and did not say anything. He read it. He read it again. He set it down. He did not speak for a long moment, and Nell waited, because she understood that there are moments in a person's life that require the time they require, and this was one of them. "My father built this ranch," Samuel said finally. "He built it from nothing, 30 years. He died thinking it would last another generation." He looked at the letter. "I spent 6 years thinking I was watching it die and couldn't stop it," he said. "I thought the problem was me, that I didn't have what he had." He looked up at her. "What did I have?" he said. "You had good bones," Nell said quietly. He was still for a moment, and then for the first time since she had arrived at Whitaker Ridge, "Samuel." Whitaker put his elbows on the table and covered his face with his hands, not in defeat, not in despair, but in the particular overwhelmed relief of a man who has been carrying an impossible weight and has just now set it down. She did not reach across the table. She did not offer comfort in words. She just sat there present and steady the way she sat, with damaged work, attentive, unhurried, trusting the process. After a moment, he lowered his hands. He looked at her with eyes that were honest in a way they had not been before. "I want you to know," he said, "that whatever happens when Blackwell arrives, whether we win or lose, what you've done here changes the ranch. It changed what it is. It doesn't go back." "I know," she said. "Do you know that you changed it?" he said. "Not the business, the place, the way it feels to be here." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said again, and quieter. "I've felt it too." There was something between them in the kitchen that night that had been building since the first morning she had found him looking at the grain sacks in his equipment shed. Something that had never been announced, never been hurried, that had grown at the pace of honest work and real trust, and the slow accumulated weight of days spent solving hard problems side by side. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. She did not pull back. They sat like that for a while in the quiet kitchen, and the wind came across the ridge and the lamp burned steady, and outside the barn stood solid and full of good work. And both of them knew without saying that the debt was almost paid, and the hardest part was almost behind them. And the hardest part after that, the part about choosing to believe in a future, was still ahead, and they were going to walk toward it anyway. $60 came in over the following week from 2 homesteader invoices, collected a new customer who brought 3 saddlebags for repair, and a settler whose wagon cover Nell had rebuilt in the summer, and who returned now with 2 of his neighbors' covers and a referral from the Garrett family up north, who had apparently been telling everyone they met between here and Dodge that a woman named Bennett in Red Willow had repaired their crown seam better than the original manufacturer. On the morning the 60-day deadline arrived, Nell counted the money. She did it at the kitchen table before dawn, with Samuel sitting across from her and a lantern between them. She counted it twice. She looked up. "We have enough," she said. Samuel closed his eyes, just for a second. "How much over?" he said. $11.40, she said. He almost laughed. It came out strange, not quite a laugh, not quite something else. The sound of a man who has been serious for so long that his face has half forgotten how to make the other expression. $11.40, he said. "And a half," Nell said. I rounded down. This time he did laugh briefly, and it was a good sound in the kitchen, honest and surprised, the laugh of a man returning to himself. They drove into Red Willow together. Nell had the money in a canvas envelope she had stitched herself double-seamed with a reinforced closure which Samuel had noticed and said nothing about, but which had made him press his lips together in a way she recognized as suppressed feeling. Amos rode behind them, not because he had been asked, but because Amos Reed had been on Whitaker Ridge for 11 years, and he had opinions about how this day should go. Billy came too, and Margaret, who had driven herself in from her homestead that morning, without any explanation beyond arriving at 6 o'clock with her good coat on. Clara was at the barn, with Ruth and Saya and Annie maintaining the operation because Nell had said very clearly that the work does not stop for ceremony, and they had understood and stayed. Blackwell arrived at the ranch at 10 o'clock, same as the notice had specified. He came with his lawyer, a thin man named Hardcastle, who carried a briefcase and stood with the careful neutrality of a professional who serves whoever pays him. He came with the land assessor, who had his notebook and his measuring tools. He came with two men Nell didn't recognize, witnesses probably, or men Blackwell had brought, to make the event feel settled. He did not come expecting to lose. She could see it in the comfortable set of his shoulders, the almost pleasant expression on his face, the way his eyes moved over the yard and the barn with the proprietorial attention of a man doing preliminary inventory. Samuel met him on the porch steps. Blackwell started to speak. Nell walked past Samuel and stood at the wagon. "Mr. Hardcastle," she said, "I understand you're here to receive or process a debt payment on behalf of your client." The lawyer looked at her, then at Blackwell, then back at her. "That's correct," he said. She opened the canvas envelope and placed the money on the wagon's running board. "Full principal," she said. "Full interest calculated to today's date. I'd like you to count it, please, in front of everyone present." Hardcastle looked at Blackwell. Blackwell's pleasant expression had shifted. Not broken, he was a man who had practiced control over a long career, but shifted the way a card player's expression shifts when the hand goes differently than the mathematics suggested it should. "Count it," he said to Hardcastle. Smoothly, still smooth. Hardcastle counted it. He was thorough. He separated the bills, counted the coins cross-referenced against the document he was carrying. The yard was completely silent. The ranch hands stood along the fence. Margaret stood near the barn door with her arms at her sides. Amos Reed stood 10 feet behind Samuel with the expression of a man who has waited 11 years for this particular morning. Hardcastle finished counting. He looked at Blackwell. "It's all present," he said. "Principal and interest full amount." Blackwell was quiet for a moment. "Count it again," he said. "Virgil," Hardcastle said quietly with the tone of a professional who has just been asked to embarrass himself unnecessarily. "It's all there." Blackwell looked at the money. He looked at Nell. He looked at Samuel. Then he looked at the barn, at Margaret in the doorway, at the organized operation visible through the open walls, at the evidence everywhere he looked of a failing ranch that had not failed, of a woman he had underestimated in every calculation he had made for the last 2 months. "Mark the note satisfied," Samuel said. Hardcastle opened his briefcase, took out the original debt note, and wrote across it in clear, decisive strokes. He handed it to Samuel. Samuel held it. He held it the way a man holds something he has been afraid of for a long time, and can now hold without fear, carefully, with the awareness of what it weighs. Blackwell looked at Nell one more time. His voice when he spoke was controlled. Rueful, almost. the voice of a man making the best of a bad position. "I'll give you credit, Miss Bennet," he said. "You are more resourceful than I anticipated." Nell looked at him steadily. "That's the calculation you made wrong from the beginning," she said. "You decided what I was capable of before you had any evidence. That's a poor way to do business, Mr. Blackwell. It's also a poor way to read people." She held his gaze. "People usually surprise you," she said, "when someone finally stops deciding their limits for them." Blackwell said nothing. He nodded once, not in agreement, not in defeat, but in the acknowledging way of a man who has encountered something he did not expect and is revising his understanding of the territory, and he climbed back onto his wagon, and Hardcastle climbed up beside him, and the assessor put away his notebook and followed, and the wagon moved down the road toward Red Willow. The yard stayed quiet until the wagon cleared the gate. Then Amos Reed said to no one in particular, "Well," and Billy Turner exhaled like he had been holding it since 10 o'clock. And Margaret from the barn doorway called across the yard, "Someone want to tell me if we still have a ranch?" "We still have a ranch," Samuel said. Margaret turned and went back to work. Samuel stood on the porch steps with the debt note in his hand, and he looked at it once more, and then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. He looked at Nell. She was watching him. Not with triumph. She was not a person who experienced triumph loudly, but with the clear, warm steadiness of someone who has seen a hard thing through to the other side, and is standing now in the particular quiet that comes after. "Come inside," he said. She climbed the porch steps. He held the door. She walked through it, and he followed, and the door closed behind them, and the debt was paid, and the ranch was theirs, and outside the barn, the work was already continuing, because Nell Bennett had built something that did not stop for victory any more than it stopped for difficulty. It just kept going. That was the nature of things built to last. The morning after Blackwell left, Nell was back in the barn at 5 o'clock. Not because she had to be, because that was who she was. The winter maintenance contract still had 3 weeks left on it. Annie had 2 new saddlebags waiting on the intake shelf. Ruth had a homesteader's storage tarp half finished on her table from the afternoon before. The work had not stopped for the debt, and it did not stop for the victory, because Nell had never once confused a battle won with a war finished. Billy found her there an hour later. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her bent over the work table in the early dark, and he said, "You know you're allowed to take a morning." "I know," Nell said without looking up. "Are you going to?" "No," she said. He came in and picked up his own work without another word. That was how it started the morning after, and the morning after that, and the slow accumulation of days that turned the crisis behind them into the foundation beneath them. But something had changed. The town felt it before it understood it. The way a room feels different when a window that has been painted shut for years is finally opened. Same room, same furniture, same walls. But the air moves differently, and everyone in it breathes a little easier without being able to say exactly why. Horace Blackwell was still in Red Willow. His store was still open, his lamp still lit, his sign still hanging. But the supply contract with the railroad had been terminated following Hardcastle's review of the thread receipts, and that review had been quiet but thorough. And 3 ranchers who had been buying replacement equipment from Blackwell on his recommendation had independently hired Nell's team to assess what actually needed replacing versus what had been sold to them as beyond repair. In 2 of the 3 cases, the answer was nothing needed replacing yet. The ranchers did not make public speeches about this. They just stopped ordering from Blackwell and started bringing their equipment to Nell, and in a community where business relationships are personal and silence carries weight, that shift was louder than any accusation. Pettifer, the man who had relayed Blackwell's first rumor about failed repairs, came to the barn on a Tuesday in December. He had his hat in his hands and a set of harness straps over one arm, and his expression was the expression of a man who has recently had the occasion to feel embarrassed about himself and is hoping to address it practically rather than verbally. Nell looked at the harness straps. "Bring them in," she said. He did, She assessed them without referring to anything that had passed between them, quoted him a fair price, completed the work in 2 days, and when he came to collect, he said gruffly and without embellishment, "Good work, Miss Bennet." "Thank you, Mr. Pettifer," she said. He paid and left, and Margaret, watching from across the barn, said dryly, "That's as close to an apology as that man has ever gotten." "It's enough," Nell said. And she meant it. The woman who had once called Nell's work improper and her figure unsuitable for polite mention came to the barn in the second week of December with a torn family quilt folded over both arms. She was a Mrs. Alderman, wife of one of the town's deacons, and she arrived with the stiff posture of someone who has rehearsed a difficult conversation and is hoping not to need it. She did not need it. Nell took the quilt, examined the damage, 3 seams failing at once, old thread giving out after decades of use, and said the repair would take 4 days and cost $1.20. Mrs. Alderman stood there for a moment. "I owe you an apology," she said stiffly, because she had rehearsed it and was going to deliver it whether it was comfortable or not. "You don't owe me anything," Nell said. "Come back Thursday and the quilt will be ready." Mrs. Alderman left, and she came back Thursday, and she paid the $1.20, and she looked at the repaired quilt for a long moment before she folded it. "My mother made this," she said. "I know," Nell said. "That's why I used the original stitch pattern. She used a double thread technique that was common in the 1840s. I matched it." Mrs. Alderman looked up from the quilt. Something in her face moved. She didn't say anything more. She just nodded once and tucked the quilt under her arm and went home. And the following Sunday, she told 3 women at her church about the repair, and 2 of them came to the barn the following week. That was how respect moved in a small community. Not in declarations, in referrals. Samuel noticed the change the way he noticed most things, quietly, without announcing that he had noticed. He was rebuilding the bunkhouse floor in the second week of December, which was a job he had been postponing for 2 years, and he was doing it himself, plank by plank, measuring twice, setting each board with care. Billy helped when he could. Amos handed him tools and made comments about the levelness of the work that were technically observations and actually companionship. One evening, Samuel came into the barn and stood at the work table where Nell was doing the final quality check on a batch of completed railroad maintenance items, and he watched her work through 3 items before he said anything. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead," she said without looking up. "When you walked off that stagecoach in Red Willow," he said, "and you saw my face, what did you think?" She held the canvas item up to the lantern, checked the grommet line, set it down. "I thought," she said, "that you were a decent man having an honest reaction that you hadn't yet learned to be ashamed of." He was quiet. "And now?" he said. She looked at him then, full direct, the way she looked at everything she assessed seriously. "Now, I think you're the same decent man," she said. "Except now, you know to be ashamed of it." He stood with that for a moment. "That is not a compliment," he said. "No," she said. "It's better than a compliment. It's the truth." He picked up one of the completed maintenance items from the inspected pile and turned it over in his hands, examining the work. "Nell," he said. "Samuel. I want to rename the operation," he said. "On paper, formally. I want it to say Whitaker and Bennett." She looked at him steadily. "You mentioned this before. I mean it more specifically now," he said. "I want your name on the deed, on the barn, on the contract letterhead, equally." The barn was very quiet. "That's a considerable thing," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know what it is." "You understand that half the county will have opinions about it." "Half the county had opinions about you the day you arrived," he said. "I find I'm less interested in their opinions than I used to be." She looked at him. He looked back at her. "Is it only a business arrangement?" she said. She asked it the same way she asked every important question, directly, without decoration, because she had no patience for answers that arrived wrapped in something other than what they were. Samuel set the canvas item down. He crossed the space between them and he stood close enough that she could see every line of his face in the lantern light, every year of grief and work and stubbornness and gradual earned hope. "No," he said. "It is not only a business arrangement. You know it isn't. You have known it for a while." "Yes," she said. "I have." "Then I am asking you," he said, plainly and without ceremony, "because I think you deserve a plain question more than a dramatic one. Will you stay, not as a practical arrangement, as my wife, as my partner, as the person this ranch belongs to as much as it belongs to me?" The lantern flame was steady. Outside, the winter wind moved across the ridge. Nell looked at this man who had come to her first as a disappointment and had become over months of honest work and quiet evenings and the slow revelation of what a person actually is when the circumstances are hard enough to strip away the performance of who they want to be. Looked at him and felt the warmth she had been carefully not naming move into something she was willing to name now. "Yes," she said, "just that." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood like that in the barn that had become the center of everything they had built together, and neither of them needed to make it bigger than it was, because what it was already enough. The news reached the town before the week was out. It traveled the way all true things travel in small communities, ahead of any announcement absorbed into the fabric of daily conversation, before anyone has officially said a word. By Friday, 3 people had congratulated Samuel on the main street. By Saturday, 2 women had come to the barn with small gifts, a jar of preserved peaches from Ruth's own cellar, a length of good cotton from Mrs. Cooper at the dry goods store presented without ceremony, and received the same way. Margaret's congratulation was characteristically Margaret. She looked up from her table when Nell told the team, and she said, "About time," and went back to work. Clara cried briefly and happily, and then apologized for crying. "Don't apologize," Nell said. "Cry if you want to." Annie Walker clapped her hands together once, like a child who has been trying to contain delight, and finally can't, and then looked embarrassed about it, and then laughed at herself, which was the most purely joyful thing Nell had heard in the barn since they started. Saya said nothing. She set down her work, walked to Nell, and pressed her hand briefly, and went back to her table, and that was exactly right. Billy said from across the barn, "Does this mean I report to both of you now?" "You always reported to both of us," Nell said. "You just didn't know it." He grinned so wide it changed the shape of his face. And Amos Reed, who had known before any of them, who had watched from the beginning with the patient attention of a man who has lived long enough to recognize something real when he sees it, said nothing at all. He tipped his hat to Nell when she passed him in the yard, and that was all, and it was exactly the right amount. The twist in all of this. The thing nobody in Red Willow had anticipated, including Nell herself, came not from Blackwell, not from any external threat, but from Annie Walker. 3 days after the announcement, Annie came to the barn with a letter in her hand and a look on her face that was equal parts excitement and apology. "Miss Bennett," she said. "Mrs. Whitaker, I need to tell you something." Nell looked at her. "My cousin," Annie said, "has a freight operation in Salina. She wrote to me last month after I told her about the work here. She wants to know—" Annie stopped, steadied herself. "She wants to know if I'd consider coming to Salina to set up a repair workshop there. She'd stake the initial materials. I'd run the operation." The barn went very quiet. Nell held Annie's eyes for a long moment. "That's a serious opportunity," she said. "I know," Annie said. "And I know the timing is The timing is fine," Nell said. Annie looked uncertain. I don't want you to think I'm leaving because—" "Annie," Nell said, "listen to me." Annie stopped. "I did not train you so you could stay in this barn forever," Nell said. "I trained you so you could do exactly this. Take work you're capable of and carry it somewhere it doesn't exist yet." Annie's eyes were bright. "Will you go?" Nell said. "I think so," Annie said. "Yes, I think I will." "Then go," Nell said. "And write to me when you have the first customer. I want to know." Annie left 2 weeks later in January with a full set of tools that Nell helped her select and pack a written reference that Nell had taken more care with than almost anything she had written, and the knowledge of everything Nell had taught her from her first day in the barn to her last. She was 19 years old. She was carrying a craft into new territory, and that, Nell thought, watching the wagon carry Annie east towards Salina in the cold January morning, was exactly how things were supposed to grow. By spring, Whitaker and Bennett Ranch and Repair Works was a going concern in the fullest sense. The cattle herd was recovering, the barn was expanded, the bunkhouse had a new floor, and the kitchen had a stove that worked without negotiation. The south fence was rebuilt. The creek crossing was reinforced. The equipment was sound throughout, maintained on a regular schedule by people who knew what they were doing and why it mattered. 3 women from the original team were now taking independent customers of their own, managing their own intake and delivery and payment, using the barn as their workshop base under an arrangement that gave Nell and Samuel a modest percentage and gave the workers the majority of what they earned. It was not a complicated system. It was just fair. Margaret supervised quality control with an exacting standard that had already sent back 2 items for rework and made Billy redo a grommet line from scratch on a Monday morning when he had thought it was good enough. "It's not good enough," Margaret had said. "It's close," Billy had said. "Close is for horseshoes," Margaret had said, and handed it back to him. He had redone it, and it had been better, and Margaret had looked at the improved work and said nothing, which was her way of saying it was right. Billy was training now himself. A young man from a homesteader family who had asked to learn the way Billy once had, showing up at the barn door with something broken and a question underneath it. Nell recognized the type because she had been the type once, standing at the door of the St. Louis workshop at 24, with a piece of her father's ruined canvas and nothing to offer but the need to learn. She had let him in the same way she had been let in. That was the only way it worked. One evening in April, Samuel came to the barn just as Nell was finishing the last item on her table. The light was long and the air was warm and the ridge smelled like grass coming back, and Samuel stood in the doorway for a moment, doing the thing he had done since the first weeks, just being near the work, letting it reach him. "Come look at something," he said. She went. He led her to the kitchen. There were curtains on the windows. Blue curtains, simple and strong, hem-stitched double, and the fabric reinforced at the hanging points, so they would last a decade of use without fraying. Nell stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at them. She had made them in an evening 2 weeks ago, between a harness job and a new supply of canvas for the next railroad order. She had not mentioned them. She had put them up one morning before anyone was awake and gone straight to the barn. "You finally made them," Samuel said. "I said I could sew," she said. "I just didn't say curtains were a priority." He was standing next to her in the doorway, and he looked at the curtains, and he looked at her, and his expression was the expression she had learned meant he was feeling something he did not have a direct word for, and was deciding whether to try. He tried. "When I wrote to the matrimonial agency," he said, "I asked for a woman who could cook plain meals, and bring order to a neglected house." "I know," she said. "I did not get any of those things," he said. "Not the way I imagined them." "No," she said, "you didn't." "I got something else," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did." He put his hand at the small of her back, gentle and steady, the way he touched things he intended to keep. "The curtains are good," he said. "They're adequate," she said. "They're good, Nell." She looked at them. Simple and blue and strong, hanging in the morning light of a kitchen in a house on a ridge in Kansas, in a home that had been failing and was now unquestionably and by every measure she knew how to apply sound. "All right," she said. "They're good." Outside the ranch was alive with morning sound, the cattle moving, Amos crossing the yard, Margaret's wagon coming up the road 3 days a week, as reliably as weather, the barn already warm with work, and the voices of people who had found in this place something they had not been offered anywhere else. A woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in a brown traveling gown with a battered suitcase and a roll of tools across her back, and been met with a look that said she was not what anyone expected. She had not argued with the look. She had simply shown them what she could do. And what she could do had turned out to be everything that mattered. Samuel Whitaker had wanted a wife who could sew. He had sent for a seamstress and received instead a woman who repaired the things everyone else had already given up on the canvas: the leather, the ledger, the land, and the man himself. She had not made him into someone new. She had given him back what he had lost: faith in his own worth, his ranch's future, his right to believe that the ground beneath his feet was ground worth standing on. And Nell Bennett had not become valuable because she found a husband, or built a business, or paid a debt, or proved the town wrong. She had been valuable before she arrived. She had been valuable when no one could see it. She had simply refused, with every stitch and every seam and every honest word in every hard conversation, to let anyone else's failure of imagination become the final word on what she was. That was the thing she had rebuilt at Whitaker Ridge. Not the barn, not the business, not the marriage, not even the man. She had rebuilt the understanding of what a person is worth, and she had built it so well with such careful and deliberate craft that no storm, no creditor, no rumor, and no small-minded calculation would ever pull that seam apart again.